Hi, my name is Joseph Rotenberg. I'm the author of a book that I recently published called Timeless Travels, Tales of Mystery, Intrigue, Humor, and Enchantment. Buy my book on Amazon. You'll have a great time reading it, I promise you. I'm talking today with Rabbi Sol Solomon on Dave's Gone By. Shalom Aleichem, Greeley.
Oh, shalom, my friends. Shalom, damn it, my enemies. And welcome to all of you. Let me tell you something. You know, I love doing this program. You know, I also love music and theater and art. And, of course, I also love Israel. Well, let me tell you something about our guest today in the neighborhood. This man, Joseph Rotenberg, knows Israel. He has been there 30 times. He went to university there, and yeah, he has mostly lived actually in a place, you should pardon the expression, called New Jersey. But he knows Israel so much, and he's even written a book that is just suffused with Israeli history and culture and heritage and modern times as well. It's called Timeless Travels, Tales of Mystery, Intrigue, Humor, and Enchantment. It was recently published by Geffen Publishing. You've got to get it, and you've got to hear him now talking about his tales. One Amazon reader said of the book, Timeless Travels, quote, "Now reading it for the second time, even knowing how the stories end, I find myself nodding along as Rotenberg paints a tapestry more beautiful than the cloak depicted on the book's cover." So please, will you welcome the modern Orthodox Jew and author, Joseph Rotenberg. Shalom, Joseph.
Shalom to you, Rabbi. What a beautiful introduction.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it is a beautiful cover on that book. Is it a depiction of Joseph's coat of many colors or something else on there?
Absolutely. You nailed it, Rabbi.
Why, thank you.
This was a woodcut, a painted woodcut, which I received as a birthday present from the author, a well-known Israeli artist called Ben Avram, a student of Chagall, and it hangs on one of my levels of the split level here in New Jersey where I live.
Wow. Now, did you know that I, too, am a student of Chagall? Irving Chagall, he taught me math in 5th grade. And used to beat my knuckles when I get, now, bad memory. But you have so many good memories of going to Israel. Let's talk about the first time you made Aliyah. How old were you?
Well, I didn't actually make Aliyah, being, an American citizen. I went as a student. First time I visited Israel was in 1967, shortly after completing high school in New York. One of my uncles, recently widowed, said, "Joe, I'm going to Israel. You want to come along?" My parents said, okay. And at 17 and a half, those days, the airplane of choice was a 707. Did not have the fuel capacity to get to the Middle East without stopping twice. So I went with, I believe in those days, it was Olympic Airways, Onassis' Airway.
Yeah.
Got nauseous being my first flight ever. By the time I got to Tel Aviv, I wanted to give up flying. But it was a wonderful adventure. This was just in the wake of the Six-Day War.
So this was after, because I would figure 1967 is the last year anybody would want to be going to Israel. But the war was over by then?
Well, they call it the Six-Day War. It didn't last that long.
True.
And in late May to early June of 67, and I guess I arrived in Israel in August and spent 3 weeks there. It was eye-opening, just visiting all the historic biblical places that I had read about. I grew up in a modern Orthodox home, so that was my first taste in the Bible of great literature. And from there, it was like walking through the pages of history. It was amazing experience.
Let me ask you for our listeners, because amazingly enough, we have some goyish listeners. Not a lot of shiksas, but we do have some shaygitzes, some goys. So, could you explain to us, when you say modern Orthodox, people may not know, you're not walking around like the Chabadniks.
The Jewish people were either observant of the law, what we call the halakha, which is a Jewish law, or they weren't. I don't think at any time in history, maybe even going back to biblical times, if you had 15 or 20% of the population who was truly observant, and the rest of the population blended in with what the local populations were like, so they weren't particularly observant of Jewish traditions. Only in America did we have a sectarian, breaking down into various sects. Reform Judaism, who believe that the religion has to be modified to reflect modern times, conservative sort of in the middle, and Orthodox, keeping the older traditions, the rabbinic rules, as well as the biblical rules.
But there's also a difference between heavy Orthodox and what people call the modern.
Exactly, right. It's a good point. You can break down the Orthodox into those who, let's say, are the Hasidim, who are what today is called the ultra-Orthodox. It's that old question of saying that you think you're religious, but you're not as religious as I am, not as observant as I am. Well, ultimately, there's matters of faith, right, and what you believe, and frankly, no matter what your traditional beliefs are, and this certainly relates to the non-Jewish world, if it doesn't assist you in making moral, ethical judgments in your day-to-day life, interpersonal relationships, then you can pray 3 times a day, 5 times a day. It's not going to make a difference if it doesn't have that transformative effect on the person doing the praying, so he becomes a better person. I mean, it sounds like I'm on a soapbox, but that's my personal belief.
Well, I know, it is a shame that we have to break all these things down into different sects. For me, the only sects that are important are oral sex and anal sex, of which I partake myself.
Among some, that is true. Others are more traditional.
But do you wear a yarmulke all the time?
Not all the time, because I rely on rabbinical edicts that when I'm out in the general world population where I'm employed, I don't necessarily have my head covered. But at home, I observe the kosher rules, and I attend synagogue and wear tefillin. And to call myself Orthodox, those are sort of the Sabbath and kashrut are, the base.
It is a rather personal question, but how much of what you do in terms of being modern Orthodox is really just culturally instilled in you and almost genetically by your parents versus really believing, and how deeply do you believe in Hashem?
I would say I deeply believe in Hashem, but on the other time, just to the beginning of your question, the idea, I was born into an Orthodox Jewish home, so I was not the iconoclast, let's say, that Abraham was. A recent book I read in the last year or two defines Abraham as having been an Amorite, one of the tribes of Canaan, historically. He made a major leap because he went from the religion or the beliefs of his family and came up with this idea of monotheism, okay? That's a major leap. Yeah. Most people are not going to make that kind of voyage during their lives. As a matter of fact, I'm working on short stories, which is the genre of my book. My book is a collection of 62-odd short stories and essays.
And the book, by the way, let's remind people, it's called Timeless Travels.
And it refers to actually, travels that I've undertaken during my life, my travel experiences, as well as the travel going from young to old. Child of Harold. Child is the father of the man. There's a lot of poetic underlining to the stories.
Did you start this almost as a blog and then compile them, or you were just writing for yourself, or at what point did you think, a book?
I started writing about 5 years ago, actually, and I had 5 or 6 of these stories in my Word files, and they were going nowhere, but I was the kind of guy who tells, great stories at family parties and get-togethers. The raconteur, the volunteer for the shul play or, the dinner video. So, given that, I evolved as a result. Actually, I was watching my grandson playing in a Little League game. He's a pretty good pitcher. And I befriended a newspaper publisher who had a son on the team. He loved my humor, and he asked me to write a sample column for the local periodical. And that turned into more than 30 stories over a 2-year period.
Oh.
That became the core of the book.
That's wonderful. And by the way, are you still writing for that periodical?
I was about, when I gave you that indication of the evolution or the travels, that religious travels a person might take during their lifetime or the journey, I recently had published the story of one of my cousins who was a lieutenant, junior grade in the 1950s in the U.S. Navy. And I found online the cruise book. This was on the USS destroyer, the Newman K. Perry, a ship, that in World War II, I believe, and in Korea, had been commissioned. And here he was, and there were pictures of this gentleman who married one of my cousins back in the 60s. What was interesting about him was he was literally, a Sutton Place, Fifth Avenue, non-Orthodox Jew. He somehow got under the influence of a group of local rabbis, and he ended up making the evolution where he became a chassid.
the book, though, that you've already done, because the first part of it is very specific, very Israel story and travelogue specific. And let's take you back to even when that first time out of high school, when you went in 1967, you spent a couple of weeks. Most people would be like, oh, once-in-a-lifetime thing, maybe I'll go back in 10, 20, 30 years. But no, what happened? You kept going back and back and back to Israel.
I kept going back and back. I mean, my experiences, it was fashionable, let's put it this way, in my circle, to spend your junior year abroad. And once the Six-Day War came, it gave a spark of development to Israel. And I climbed on board and experienced, it was, you had a chance to be visiting a frontier. It became a frontier.
You went to college there.
I spent my junior year there. In 69, 70, I was at Columbia College in Manhattan. I reversed a lot of patterns that people had. You go to school further and further away from where you were born and brought up.
Yeah.
When I went to college, it was 2 or 3 bus stops up Broadway from where I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But for my junior year, I escaped to Israel for 12 months, and it was a fascinating experience, giving me lots of material for stories and the volume that's out now, as well as the other one I'm working on now.
Well, whether it's in one of the books or not, let me ask, because we love anecdotes on this show. We love stories, whether they're scary or funny or happy or something. So what, for example, was the funniest or one of the funniest anecdotes that ever happened to you in Eretz Yisrael?
More ironic humor than laugh-out-loud humor.
Okay.
But in the story that I call High Gear, Low Gear, No Gear, the story of a 19-year-old, without telling his parents, decides he wants to take lessons to qualify for a license, an Israeli license, as a motor scooter driver, a Vespa driver. This happened to me, and of course, like a naive 19-year-old, I walk into the school there in Jerusalem, the middle of downtown Jerusalem, and I ask them, approximately how many lessons do you think it'll take to get my license, to get proficient enough? And without missing a beat, the Israeli schoolmaster there says, no one passes the first time. So right away, that little ironical culturally, I said, well, why don't you just give me enough lessons so, based on my skill level, I can pass. That thought never seemed to cross their mind. Of course, when I discovered that the clerk at the licensing office was a cousin of the people who ran the school, that's an education.
But what was it to them, whether you passed or not, or everybody failed the first time? They wanted people to take more lessons, but they could just give people more lessons anyway. I don't get it.
That's what I assumed. No, you would think that they would get there, but if you build into the system that you're not passing the first time, I mean, also humorous was the day of the test. 19 or 20 unlicensed scooter applicants, such as myself, drive up in the center of town, and we await a Marlon Brando-like figure from the Wild Ones. He comes in with these reflective glasses. We have one teacher, and he tells us that the test consists of driving through, it would be like driving through, Times Square without a license. Follow the leader to the train station on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and then they're going to send you through wheelies and various maneuvers, and then find your way back, if you have any sense of direction, to where we started. Well, I managed to survive. Obviously, I'm talking to you now, 40 years later. But it was an experience. And, of course, when you got the results, it was failed. Needs more practice. Now,
of course.
Okay.
Of course. Now, let me ask also, since, again, we're in Israel for so long a period and so many different times, do you ever have a scary experience or a terror experience kind of a thing?
Well, in 67, I wandered off wearing my sunglasses at sunset, right?
Yeah.
On a tour of the Dead Sea with a very well-known touring company called Egged Bus Tours, right? Their drivers ran the city buses, but also did tours, and it was a major industry post-67. So as the sun was setting there in the Dead Sea, out in the wilderness of Judea, I decided I wanted to go away from the group and start climbing some hills in that area overlooking the Dead Sea to get a different vista.
So you break away from the tour group. It's already sunset. It's dark.
I maybe went 5 1,000 feet away, not further than that.
All right.
As I'm going there, I'm apprehended by Israeli border guards.
Yeah.
Can't make out. And of course, Mrs. May of the Prime Minister of England might not like this, but they heard me speak and they said, in Hebrew, which I understand very well, they said, he's a Briti. Yeah, he's British. They thought I was spying for the Jordanians. I have no idea, but they put me in their truck and I was interrogated. I'm sure I was very frightened at the time. So
did they let you go that night, or did they keep you over, or what?
They let me go once I don't know if I produced a passport or some document, but I said, he's not a terrorist, infiltrator, because that was a border area, and they were, they might have been trigger happy, so I'm glad they didn't. Can I interject just with what you asked me for a humorous exchange?
Oh, please, yes.
And this is something I recount in my lecture. In Israel, again, starting in 67, I would occasionally take out girls on a date. And I wanted to get a restaurant that was more American style. And in the lobby of the King David Hotel, a very famous hotel in Jerusalem, they had a dairy restaurant, like, the ones that, the major urban Jewish restaurants. I could only do this sparingly because I was obviously on a student's budget. But I remember one time, because this was in the center of the capital, who do I see sitting at the table next to me? And this is a true story. Golda Meir, the prime minister, Abba Eban, the foreign minister, and Moshe Dayan with his eye patch, the general.
Good God, yeah.
A few bodyguards hanging around for good measure. At the table right next to me. Now, at one point, since I was eavesdropping, Abba Eban tried to take the last piece of cake on the table, and Dayan pulled it away before he could get it. This is a fantastic sight. Golda finally, she settles it. She takes the cake, cuts it in half, and makes a Solomonic for you solution. Okay?
Yeah.
Rabbi Solomon would have done. She cuts it in half. Now, here, the thing that struck me was these three people, famous historical figures, right, must have been meeting in Jerusalem about Israel's urgent security and military issues, right? And the meal ends with a battle over cake.
Well, essentially everything is a battle over cake, if you think about it metaphorically. And notice that Golda could have cut it into thirds, but...
no question. And the UN still would have been upset with the division.
Well, that is such a... nowadays, you would have walked over, you would have asked the guards to take a selfie, but I assume you didn't get a picture or any...
No, in those days, you had it was rotary phones, that was it.
But more importantly, you were on a date. How did the date go? Did you get anything from the girl?
1968 was a good year in Israel, we'll put it that way. Number 68.
Oh, yeah. That's the book I want to read by Joseph Rotenberg.
Yeah.
Getting laid in Israel back in the 1960s.
Happily married to my lovely wife, Barbara, of 46 years.
Oh, mit Mazel. How'd you meet her?
Oh, when I came back from my junior year in Israel, I was feeling, like a big man on campus, right? My senior year is approaching. So before school started, I went to the religious center. It's called Earl Hall, off of Broadway and 119th Street. And I'm sitting, it's a rainy day, as I recall. In walked two young ladies who I didn't recognize. This is because my wife had her freshman year while I was in Israel. So now she was a sophomore at Barnard, across the street, Barnard College. I saw this young lady with long blonde hair and blue eyes, and I actually asked her I made a signal for her to come over. She did, which was a good sign. And I asked her about the other girl she was with. So much for being gallant or not being gallant.
Yeah, boy, you got moves. You go off hill climbing at sundown away from the thing. You're interested in a girl and you ask about her friend. So when you make it to the age you are.
Within a month, I was smitten. It turned out she was brighter than I was and still is. I was a decent student, but she was sort of the Wayne Gretzky of students, we call her in our family. In other words, she highly skilled, but also her work ethic, no one outworked her. On dates, I would have to sit there doing the crossword puzzle from the New York Post while she was doing her homework for schoolwork.
Wow. Wow. Well, besides marrying you and giving you wonderful children, what did she do?
She works in education. She's an administrator at a school with 700 to 800 students here in northern New Jersey.
And you, by the way, we should tell people that for a while you were a tax attorney. Now you run a financial firm?
No, I don't run a financial firm. I mean, all I'm allowed to say by my employer is that I work in the financial service industry, but I make a living.
Make a better living than a rabbi does, I'll tell you that for sure.
You know, I had a choice to become a rabbi, I guess. And many of my friends got smicha. That's more characteristic, I would say, of the modern Orthodox, rather than spending the entire day learning, which is more to the right of...
Oh, I see, yeah.
You want a historical piece, a real headline, and I should give it to you.
Oh, give it to me.
I coached Jared Kushner in high school in hockey.
All right, now this is hilarious for two reasons. First of all, if you see, with all due respect, this man on the cover, the inside cover of his book, Timeless Travels, when you're a decently handsome middle-aged person, but no one would think of you in terms of hockey, playing, coaching, tax attorney, yes, financial person, sure, but the idea that you have coached hockey teams, it's with all due respect, rather amusing. But...
And I have to tell you, you think it's amusing, but the truth is my son Yoni, my middle son, won as an Orthodox Jewish kid, which meant he didn't play from Friday night, until Saturday when the 3 stars came out. He traveled with teams at the highest levels when he was a squirt, 10 or 11, and they won the U.S. District Championship for the Middle Atlantic region, with him as one of the goaltenders on the team.
Jews in sports, my good, and in hockey yet.
And you know what? To show the genes that, and I have to give credit to my daughter-in-law, my grandson, who I mentioned at the baseball game, where he's a star pitcher, plays ice hockey, floor hockey, and just wins championships as a goaltender. I'll tell you one thing. I was a goalie a little bit in college, and both of my son and my grandson are adepts at stopping the puck or the ball.
My head was always adept. Whenever we had played hockey in gym, it was like, oh, there's a puck coming, let me use my head. That was the only way I could ever stop a puck. It was...
let's put it this way. They have ice water in their veins. If a goal was scored on me, I was usually pretty upset about it.
Wow. But back to what you mentioned also is that years ago, you coached a team that Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of a certain president of the United States.
Yes.
So was he a good guy? Was he nice?
He's an honorable fellow, to my knowledge, okay?
Yeah.
But I have to point out that when my son was in the Nets, this is for his high school team, the Frisch School in Paramus, New Jersey, give them a plug. When that occurred, someone centered the ball, in this case it was ball hockey, the ball off of Jared's rear past my son in the net for a self-goal. I'm still angry about it.
Still angry. You should write to Jared.
Actionable. That's actionable. And nothing else that he's done to me is... Look, we live in a political world. That's a whole different interview, but I have some strong opinions about the uncivil war that's going on right now.
Well, but let's talk a little bit about politics without getting too angry or deep.
No, I'm just saying it's fascinating when you go back and forth from Fox News to CNN, and it's like a New York Rangers, Philadelphia Flyers contest.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, I mean, you got one channel that's completely devoted to all the so-called, or maybe real scandals that are going on with the lawyer and the Cohen and this, and then you flip and it's just about border and that we're being overrun with immigrants. But it's like two different worlds going on.
Yes, and I mean, this is just with a nod to my Gentile friends, he was without sin, right?
Well, there you go, yes.
I made this point earlier in some of my writing that you could take the model with the most peachy complexion on the cover of Vogue, and if you looked at her skin under an electron microscope, it looks like the Grand Canyon, the pores, right? It's a question of how close you look. It's all a matter of perspective. Frankly, I should write a story called Perspective, the most important word in language, not just in the English language.
And I always say, he who is without shin does not play dreidel with me. A little joke, a little post-Hanukkah joke.
Avoid the shins in my dreidel playing, that would be good.
But for a little bit of Israeli politics, what I'd like to know from you is, having been there so many times, is how do the Jews over there, the Israelis, feel about Jerusalem and the Palestinian question, because I'm pretty right-wing Zionist militant myself.
I would consider myself more to the right than center-right, but I just have an issue. I believe biblically in the notion of the description that the Palestinians, or whatever they choose to call themselves, I'm into self-definition, failed to recognize who their friends are and who their enemies are. And maybe it's through the fact that as a group they were never denazified, because in the 1920s and 30s, remember, nationalism was not a dirty word.
Right.
After Versailles, everybody wanted to have their own nation-state, fine. But the marriage between the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Adolf Hitler, it was one of his buddies, he had an open ticket to the Berchtesgaden. They never were denazified. So they basically are, the papers they're reading and the books that they educate their kids with is right after the Deutsche Beobachter, the Julius Streicher, the worst anti-Semitism, the worst canards, and they're coming to the modern Israeli, the modern Jew, even the modern American Jew. They have no concept. They have no concept of who they're dealing with. That's the problem. It's a reality check. Reality check. Do you know that, in my view, and there's a story about Gaza, right, in 1967, because I visited Gaza right after the war. And guess what? The Israelis were greeted as liberators. And for what reason? The hatred that the Palestinians had, the Gazans had, for their Egyptian overlords, fellow Arabs, fellow Muslims, was so intense that the Israelis, there was a moment where politically Israel could have done a lot of different things to give autonomy to that section. They didn't do it. Let me just summarize.
Sure.
I believe that if the Arabs ever awoke one day, Gaza City, Rafiah, all the cities, Khan Yunis, this could become the Riviera of the Arab world.
If they just stopped killing.
With the help of the Israelis.
Yeah.
And with the open partnership with the Israelis. That's the potential. If you say, well, how good could it get? Right now they live in terrible condition.
Well, yeah. Would you...
Out of their own, they have choices.
Would you go for an international city of Jerusalem? Should it stay in Jewish control? Could it ever be split?
Here's the question. If it in fact recognized and allowed for the rights of everyone, I could consider that. But the question is, it's like, do you want to... John Wayne, in the Coloradans will relate to this.
Yeah.
Did you ever see him walk into the saloon where all the desperados are hanging out, right? Or hiding behind a curtain, in the upper rooms? When he exits, does he holster his gun and walk directly out through the saloon doors?
No, he kind of keeps an eye out for everything behind him, no?
Right. He'll feel behind, he'll look, check it out, and exit backwards through the saloon doors with his gun unholstered, with his gun pointing in the direction of the desperados. That's Israel's situation. It would be nice to think they could holster the gun, turn their back on these people, but
it ain't going to happen. Let me ask you, before we let you go, and I want to remind people that we've been talking with Joseph Rotenberg, author of Timeless Travels, Tales of Mystery, Intrigue, Humor, and Enchantment. It's published by Geffen Books, and you can get it, of course, on Amazon and all the usual places you can get books. Do you have a website? Can people go to a place where they find out more about you?
Actually called Timeless. It's www.timelesstravelsbook. One word. timelesstravelsbook.com.
timelesstravelsbook.com, and people can find out more about the book there. They can order it there. It's we've missed Hanukkah in terms of gift-giving ideas, but so many goyim and evangelicals are into Israel. They love Israel. They want to learn more about the history. They want to learn more about
the book.
Yeah.
And you know what it is? Because it's a series of shorter works, it's the kind of thing where you don't need a lot of time. You can have it by your bedside. You can read and chuckle and learn things and learn about characters. Being a rabbi, Rabbi Solomon, you can relate to a story called Torah and Teepees.
Torah and what?
Torah and teepees.
Oh, teepees. Ooh. Tell me about, because I thought you meant teepee like toilet paper, where this is a good toilet book because you can pick it up 2.5 minutes later, you do your business, boom, you put it down for another story. But no, you mean teepee like woo-woo Indian teepee.
No, yes, this is a story about a Polish rabbi who moves out west, breaks away from his roots somewhat, and becomes a peddler in the Oklahoma Panhandle and is captured by Comanches, by an actual chief.
Whoa!
The 3 days of their discussing religion together, the rabbi says, look, I don't understand this idea of one God, however. I'm very glad that your Jewish God created the buffalo. That's what he says in the story.
That's very cute. That's very cute. Stories like that in timeless...
Picked up by a San Diego Western Historical Society. They thought it was a true story. Now, it's partly true, but I used some poetic license in it, and I'm telling you, you'll learn about America, you'll learn about yourself, and you don't have to be like the Jewish, rye bread. You don't have to be Jewish to enjoy timeless travels.
Well, you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy talking with Joseph Rotenberg here in the neighborhood. Last question for you before we're going. It's going to be a big one. It's a heavy one. What, in all your travels, and it could be Israel or anywhere else, what is the most profound thing that's happened to you? Something that shook you emotionally, in a good or scary or whatever way?
It's quite a personal question because it probably relates to the kinds of things that affect everybody. The loss of a loved one. Those are the most profound things that affect me. I try to, being a dad of 5 children and now, thank God, 11 grandchildren, I try to keep a stiff upper lip. Maybe going back to the Middle East, that the cousins, right, the Arabs and the Jews have not reached an accommodation during my lifetime, or a better accommodation. That's been the greatest disappointment.
And will you go back to Israel? Do you see yourself going there again, once or twice or three?
Yes, well, I remember my parents were buried in Israel, and accordingly, I like to make an annual visit to their graves. It's not religiously required, but so that keeps me going back. Yes, I plan to try to do an annual. Of course, if Wall Street continues,
it
can have an effect on people's plans. I'm aware of that. I represent a lot of lovely people.
Might have to go back to doing some tax returns just to make a little spare buck these days. But no.
Well, yeah, but officially I can announce to everybody in Colorado I am retired from the practice of law. So say that.
Well, here's the deal. Hopefully you make.
But you never. Okay, look, you go to law school.
Yeah.
I try to see the humorous side of life rather than the negative. To this point, I'm a very lucky guy. I admit it.
Halavai. This is wonderful. I mean, I feel in some ways lucky too, but I'm miserable all the time. That's just me. And the thing is, I'm not miserable reading your book and talking to Joseph Rotenberg. Hopefully you'll sell 1,000 copies so that you can take 12 more trips to Israel. Remember to go to timelesstravelsbook.com to buy the book, to find out more about it, and to enjoy your time with Joseph Rotenberg as we have done here in the neighborhood. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for your writing and for your time and for your joy. Shalom to you.
Shalom to you, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Shabbat shalom.